Hi everybody, welcome to Bama Blind. I'm Beverly, and if you're new to my channel, I want to welcome you, and if you're coming back for another video, welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about actually something that is happening this week. It's Veterans Day this week on the 11th of November, 11/11. And I want to give you a little bit of history about Veterans Day and then share with you some of the awesome veterans that have been a part of my life and still are a part of my life, because I think we owe them so very much. And I know that there's a trend now to recognize veterans and particularly first responders. And I just want to share with you what I have learned just out of curiosity. I know that Veterans Day hasn't always been called that. Veterans Day was first called Armistice Day. And Armistice Day was first celebrated on November the 11th, 1919. But it actually commemorated the first annual year since the signing of the Versailles Peace Treaty. Now, World War I was supposed to be the war of all wars. It was supposed to be the Great War, the war that ended all wars. It was so horrendous, and never before had the world seen a war quite like that. And so the signing of the peace treaty in Versailles on the 11th of November in 1918 was to make a truce, to declare peace. And so the first annual commemoration of that was held in 1919. And it was called Armistice Day. And armistice just means truce or an agreement to take a break from fighting or dissension or conflict. Maybe we could use some of that right now in our country. I won't get political, but that's what armistice means. Now, they celebrated Armistice Day every year thereafter, and they called it Armistice Day. And it was celebrated up until 1938, when it was declared a national holiday. And if you think about 1938, that was prior to World War II. So what they were celebrating is peace in the world, so to speak. And it was a day to commemorate those people who had fought in that horrendous World War that we now call World War I, because then 2 years later we had World War II. And in 1954, it was changed nationally in the United States to be called Veterans Day, and it was declared a federal holiday. And from then on, it's become known as Veterans Day, and we really acknowledge and remember and actually commemorate and celebrate those people who have served in all of the armed forces of the United States. And so in looking back at my history, and I won't get too detailed on this, but I have a long family history in the United States. I've done genealogy. My uncle did significant genealogy, and I started working with him several years ago and actually found some more information, because now, as a blind person, I have access to lots and lots of information through voiceover and the internet and excellent historical websites. My uncle had documentation, so I can start back, and I actually have the documentation at my home here from my fourth great grandfather, Benjamin, who served in the Revolutionary War. Now, Benjamin was born in 1727 in Kent County, Maryland. And so that was before we were even declared a country. And he migrated down to South Carolina and begat several sons and one daughter. And all of his sons, including my third great grandfather, served in the Revolutionary War. And back then, the war was, it wasn't that you went off to war, because the war was here on the United States soil, which wasn't even the United States yet. But because it was here on our soil, what they did is my ancestors were farmers, and so they were farming their property, and then if the British, so to speak, were coming into their vicinity, my fourth great grandfather, who was too old to serve as a footman or a soldier, was the alarmsman for his community. So he sounded the alarm, the church bell. So he sounded the alarm, and then he had 6 sons and 1 son-in-law, and they all served as foot soldiers in the Revolutionary War. So, and I have that documentation. And my third great grandfather eventually migrated here to Alabama from South Carolina, and eventually was provided a pension. There was a lot of years and a lot of protests and a lot of work for veterans of the Revolutionary War to actually be compensated for serving in the war and helping the United States win its independence. So my third great grandfather eventually in 1836, now you realize that in 1776 we were in the Revolutionary War. So in 1836 he was finally awarded his pension for serving in the Revolutionary War. And then he begat a son, and the son that he begat didn't really serve in any war that I can find. He was too young to serve in the War of 1812 or the French and Indian War. But he begat a son who was my great-grandfather, and my great-grandfather served in the, some Southerners call it the war between the states, but it's the Civil War. And because I live in the South, he was on the losing side of that war, but he served along with all of the other men in our community in the Civil War, and was a Civil War veteran. Now he begat my grandfather. Now my grandfather, this probably sounds old to a lot of you, and it is. It's kind of crazy to me. My grandfather was born in 1891, and my grandfather was almost too old to serve in the Great War or World War I, but my grandfather was a World War I veteran. So he already had established a family. My father wasn't born yet, but he had a family, and he still was sent off to war. My father then was never in an active war, but my father graduated from high school and went to college on an ROTC scholarship, which meant that he signed up for 4 years of service in the Army so that he could get through college, and the Army, the ROTC, paid for his college. And then as soon as he graduated, he entered into the Army as an officer and then served overseas. Now, my father he was too young to be in the Korean War, but he was shipped to Austria, where he and my mother lived for the first year of their marriage. And I always wondered, growing up, well, what was he doing in Austria? And I couldn't ever get a grasp on what did this veteran, this man who served, my dad, who served in the Army. I know he was a medic. He was trained as a financial business person, so that was his background. But he was assigned to be a medic, and he was a medic. But in Austria, he wasn't in battle, he wasn't in any war, and he was supposed to stay there for 3 years. But suddenly, after being there for 7 months, there was a treaty signed, and he was sent back to the U.S. And I never knew what that was. I knew it wasn't the Korean War, and I knew it wasn't World War II because that ended in 1945. So about 3 years ago, when my husband and I were on a tour in Hungary and Austria and Holland, the Netherlands, we had an excellent lecture about what was going on in Austria in the mid 1950s. And that's exactly when my father and my mother were there. And they were in Salzburg, the city where The Sound of Music was filmed. And when I listened to the lecture, I found out that because of the presence of those people, those soldiers in uniform every single day in the country of Austria, in the big city of Salzburg, which is really not a big city, but it's a large city, that presence was enough to say, okay, Austria, when it comes to dividing up communism and the freedoms that the free Europeans would have, Austria was declared one of the free countries out from under the rule of communism because of the heavy presence of the United States military in all that region. So when that treaty was signed in the summer of 1955, two of the head commanders got together and decided they were trying to decide which parts of Austria would go communist and which parts would go to the non-communist or to the free nations. And they decided, Austria is basically protected by all these U.S. forces that are in uniform every single day. So all of Austria was liberated from communism. And I didn't know that till 3 years ago. That's the service that my father had put forth and proudly served, and then moved back to the United States and served out his, I believe it was 3 years that he owed to the Army for his college degree and to pay for that through the ROTC. So my father was a veteran, and then my brother, as soon as he got out of high school, he joined the Navy. So my brother is a veteran. My sister's husband, as soon as he got out of high school, he joined the Coast Guard. And so my brother-in-law is a veteran. And I am proud to say that I am married to a veteran. So yes, my husband Jerry is a veteran, and he actually has a very unique story that I won't get into the entire thing, but my husband Jerry was actually started out in the Army Reserves, and they tested him in the Army Reserves, and he tested very high in health and sciences, and he already had a degree in accounting and was working on his graduate work in accounting and already had a pretty good job in accounting. So but he was in the Army Reserves, and when they tested him, they said, "We think you would be an excellent dental assistant." And he said, "I know nothing about that. I don't want to be that. I'm not interested in that." And they said, "Oh yes, our tests show that you're very interested in that." So when the Army tells you you're interested in something, that's where you get placed. So Jerry was in the Army Reserves for about 2 years and met many dentists there, while he was working as a dental assistant. And they said, you've really got the capacity to go on to dental school. Why don't you try it? So he thought, well, why not? And he signed up for several military scholarships through the Air Force, through the Army, through the Navy, and he received a Navy scholarship to go to dental school at the University of Pennsylvania. So he went on a full scholarship as it was kind of like ROTC, but it really wasn't, because he was being trained specifically for dentistry as a naval officer. And so once he graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, he was commissioned an officer and then was stationed in Japan. And he loved Japan. He loved that overseas atmosphere travel, but he got deathly seasick. And then, he had several people telling him, well, as an active duty dentist, in the Navy, you pretty much are going to have to serve on a ship. And he had already told them before he was ever recruited that he got very seasick. We can't take cruises now, the big ocean line cruises, because Jerry gets seasick. So he thought, well, I'll just have to get out of the Navy. And a friend of his said, actually it was one of his patients who was the associate to the general of the Air Force. And he said, let me talk to my supervisor, because, if you want to stay in the military, why don't we do an internal transfer? And it worked out that my husband was in the Navy one day, and the very next day he was commissioned into the Air Force because he wanted to stay in the military. He already had 5-6 years in, so he wanted to stay, and he thought it would be a great career, but he got seasick, and he knew he wouldn't get promoted if he couldn't go on ships, because that's how, you got to go through all of the steps and sequences. And anyway, so Jerry was in the Navy one day and in the Air Force the next day. And then they sent him to officer training school in the Air Force. And so he learned to, what the Air Force did that was different than how the Navy did it. And when he was in the Navy, he had to learn how to do things differently than the Army Reserves had done it. And so my husband, Jerry, retired at age 46 with a full 22 years in the armed services, both the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. He also achieved a expert marksman credential in all 3 of the services. So which means he's very proficient with shooting and a gun and that kind of thing. And he qualified in both the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force as an expert marksman. And he originally had thought, well, I'll be in the Air Force for, until I've done 20 years. But to our surprise, they offered a retirement after 16 years of being in the Air Force if you were a dentist or if you were an RN. Those were the 2 occupations that they were offering a retirement in. Well, Jerry happened to have had 22 years in because all of his reserve duty counted as active duty. So my husband at age 46 had served in 3 of the armed services, had gotten a dental degree, and had been eligible for retirement. And that's his story as a United States veteran. And I'm so proud to be associated with him. I'm so proud of the service. He was deployed. He was overseas at least twice, once in Turkey, and that's pretty remote, and especially in the summertime. So he didn't serve in combat. He did serve in a war, and he said, unfortunately, that war continues. It's a war that he feels may never be ended, until science comes up, but he calls it the war on decay. He's a dentist, okay, y'all? So he does serve in a war, and he still holds his dental license even though he's retired from the Air Force. And I'm so, so proud to be an Air Force spouse and a wife of a veteran. And I honor all the veterans, and I remember all of the veterans that have served our country, because we would not have the freedoms that we have. And you know, I didn't learn this stuff in history. I've learned through traveling and through actually being exposed to different cultures and different people in different cultures, how important our freedoms are in the United States. And I'm so proud to be an American, and I am so grateful to those veterans that have protected those freedoms and fought for those freedoms, and they've given their lives for, they've given their time, and their spouses have given as well, whether their spouses were male or female. I did leave out one auxiliary veteran adjunct, so to speak, because my grandmother, and I haven't mentioned any women so far because I don't have any women in my family who have served and are veterans or are in active duty. But my grandmother served as a Rosie the Riveter back in World War II, and she went to the building that I pass by almost every single day and built hardware, ammunitions for the war, during World War II. So I want to also recognize those people that sacrificed, that were never commissioned or never inducted into the actual service itself. So I want to wish everyone a very honorable and memorable, and for me, a very grateful Veterans Day on the 11th of November, 11/11. And until next time, have a very safe and healthy and happy week, everyone. And happy Veterans Day. Bye-bye.